You step outside your shelter, and the air is thick with warmth. Not the cold bite you expected. This isn't the world of woolly mammoths and endless glaciers. Not yet. It's 300,000 years ago, and Earth is wild, alive, and startlingly warm in places you never imagined. The skies are streaked with volcanic haze, rivers carve through green deserts, giant predators stalk open plains, and deep in Africa, something quietly, world-changingly human has just taken its first breath. This isn't prehistory the way it's been told. This is the real story, raw, unpredictable, and more familiar than you might think. The true face of Earth's climate 300,000 years ago. People often picture a world covered in ice when they think of the distant past. They picture endless glaciers, frozen tundras, and mammoths walking through snowstorms. The Earth wasn't frozen 300,000 years ago, though. In fact, many places were warmer than they are now. This period was part of what scientists call an interglacial, a warmer phase between ice ages. These warm spells happen naturally as part of Earth's climate cycles, which are driven by changes in the planet's orbit, tilt, and wobble. Right around 300,000 years ago, the Earth was in the middle of what's known as marine isotope stage 9, a time when ice sheets had melted back, sea levels were higher, and the planet was lush with life. Surprisingly, global temperatures were about as warm, or even a little warmer, than today's averages. Some regions, especially parts of Europe and Africa, enjoyed climates that were not only mild but supported dense forests, grasslands, and large rivers. Areas that are now arid or semi-arid may have looked more like modern-day savannas or wetlands. This warm climate changed everything. Rainfall patterns shifted, expanding habitable zones for both animals and early humans. Where deserts now stretch endlessly, there were once green corridors full of life. The Sahara Desert, for example, wasn't a lifeless expanse of sand. It was dotted with rivers and lakes. These changes allowed early hominins to spread across wider areas, following herds and fresh water. Meanwhile, large ice sheets still existed at the poles, but they were smaller and more stable. The Arctic and Antarctic were colder than the rest of the world, of course, but they hadn't yet expanded into the massive glaciers that would later dominate the ice ages. Greenland's ice was patchier, and Antarctica was less extreme. Sea levels during this time were up to 10 meters, 33 feet, higher than today, flooding many coastal areas that are now dry land. For thousands of years, the temperature was stable, which helped plants and animals grow and change. A lot of Europe and Asia was covered in forests. In the past, tropical species lived farther north than they do now, and places that are cold and harsh now, like high elevations, may have had more diverse environments in the past. This wasn't just a good time for plants and animals, it was critical for humans too. These warm, stable conditions made it possible for early Homo sapiens to spread across Africa and begin pushing out into new environments. Mild weather meant fewer natural barriers like glaciers or frozen tundra. It opened up migration routes and created more opportunities for survival. Even during this interglacial, Earth's climate wasn't the same everywhere. Some regions experienced periods of drought, while others faced flooding and storms. Volcanic activity added bursts of cooling, throwing ash into the skies and disrupting local ecosystems. The planet was dynamic and often unpredictable, but overall, it was fertile ground for life. Today, when we think about climate change, we often compare everything to a normal baseline. But Earth doesn't really have a fixed normal. Climate is always shifting, sometimes slowly, sometimes violently. The interglacial world of 300,000 years ago reminds us that warm periods have always existed, but what made them survivable was time. These changes unfolded over thousands of years, not decades. This is why it's so important to understand this time. It shows how warm temperatures have affected development, migration, and even how people stay alive. We became who we are not because it was always cold, but because we learned to live in a world where warmth brought both chance and danger. Homo sapiens, we were just born. Something amazing took place around 300,000 years ago. In the rolling landscapes of North Africa, a new type of person called us gently came into the world. During this time, the oldest fossils of Homo sapiens are found. This means that our ancestry goes back a lot further than experts used to think. For decades, researchers thought our species emerged roughly 200,000 years ago in East Africa. That timeline changed dramatically in 2017, when fossils discovered in Jebel Irhoud, Morocco, were dated to approximately 300,000 years ago. These remains, skulls, jaws, and stone tools, belong to individuals who looked surprisingly modern, with flat faces and large brains. They weren't quite like us in every way, but they were close enough to be considered early Homo sapiens. This discovery didn't just change the date, it changed the map. It showed that Homo sapiens likely didn't come from one single cradle of life. Instead, our species may have evolved across multiple regions of Africa at the same time, gradually forming what we now recognize as modern humans. It wasn't a quick leap. It was a slow dance of adaptation, migration, and blending between different populations. These early humans lived in open grasslands and scattered forests. They hunted gazelles and wild antelope, gathered edible plants, and used stone tools that were more advanced than what earlier humans had created. Their toolkits included Levallois cores, carefully shaped stones designed to flake off sharp, symmetrical blades. That level of precision suggests not just intelligence, but planning, a sign of abstract thought. But they weren't farmers or people who built cities. It was hard to live. Early Homo humans had to deal with being eaten, bad weather, and not having enough food. Fire was a big plus, not just for cooking and staying warm, but also for keeping people safe and bringing people together. Most likely they lived in small groups, shared resources, and maybe even buried their dead together. Even more interesting is the fact that Homo sapiens weren't the only ones there. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and maybe even Homo heidelbergensis were still living in Europe and Asia. We are just one line of a very complicated family tree. These other hominins lived with, and sometimes bred with our ancestors for thousands of years. Still, Homo sapiens had an edge. Something, maybe the way we communicated, maybe the way we solved problems, allowed us to expand further and faster than our cousins. The roots of that advantage might trace all the way back to this moment in Morocco, where early humans were already testing new tools, exploring wider landscapes, and forming deeper social connections. Fossil evidence also suggests a gradual shift in physical features. Earlier species like Homo heidelbergensis had more robust skulls and sloped faces, but by 300,000 years ago, our ancestors had flatter faces, higher foreheads, and larger brain cases, traits that would come to define Homo sapiens. These features weren't fully formed overnight. They appeared in patches, across different populations, shaped by environment, diet, and even culture. It's also likely that our ancestors were beginning to develop more complex language. While we can't hear their voices, anatomical changes in the throat and skull, like the shape of the hyoid bone, hint at the growing ability to make a wider range of sounds. That alone would have given Homo sapiens a critical survival edge, the ability to share knowledge, warn of danger, and perhaps even tell stories. Other humans were still in charge. 300,000 years ago, Homo sapiens may have been new to the world, but we weren't the only ones or even the most powerful. In fact, other kinds of humans controlled most of Eurasia. The Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and maybe the strange Homo heidelbergensis were in charge in the woods, mountains, and cold steppe. Let's start with the Neanderthals. Far from the brutish image they've been unfairly given, Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis, were incredibly well adapted to the harsh climates of Ice Age Europe and Western Asia. Their thick, muscular builds helped retain body heat. Their wide noses were likely suited for warming cold air, and their brains, just as big, sometimes bigger than ours. Neanderthals had already been evolving for hundreds of thousands of years by the time Homo sapiens showed up. They used sophisticated tools, hunted in groups, created shelter, and likely wore simple clothing made from animal hides. They buried their dead and may have even used pigments and ornaments. They weren't simple or slow. They were survivors, shaped by brutal winters and dangerous predators. Then there were the Denisovans. We don't know what they looked like. No full skeleton has ever been found. All we have are a few teeth, a finger bone, and fragments, all from a cave in Siberia called Denisova. But through genetics, we've uncovered something stunning. Denisovans were a distinct species of human, separate from both Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, and they were prolific. Their DNA shows up in modern humans across Asia and the Pacific, especially in Melanesia and indigenous Australians. That means they weren't just hiding in one cave. They were everywhere, from the Tibetan Plateau to Southeast Asia. In other words, Homo sapiens had not yet become the most famous species in the world. We were the newest kids. Neanderthals and Denisovans were the main players. They were both smart, physically strong, and at home in their surroundings. There's also the shadowy figure of Homo heidelbergensis, a possible ancestor to both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. This species may have still been clinging to isolated regions in Africa or southern Europe around this time. Strong, large-brained, and with a more primitive skull shape, heidelbergensis represents a transitional phase, a bridge between earlier humans like Homo erectus and the more specialized species that would dominate the world. It's clear that there wasn't just one type of person ruling the world. It was a patchwork of different species that had evolved separately and sometimes crossed paths or bred with each other. Almost everyone living today has some Neanderthal DNA in them. People from Asia and Oceania also have Denisovan DNA. These were not separate groups of people. They were mixing, fighting, and changing with each other. At this point in history, Homo sapiens were probably confined to Africa. Meanwhile, Neanderthals thrived in Ice Age Europe. Denisovans roamed vast parts of Asia, and other unknown hominins may have existed in remote pockets of the world. The Earth wasn't empty. It was filled with different kinds of humans, each adapted to their own corner of the planet. This era wasn't just a waiting period for Homo sapiens to take over. It was a dynamic and competitive time in human evolution. Every species was figuring out how to survive, how to hunt, how to raise offspring, and how to push forward in an unpredictable world. And for a long time, the odds didn't favor us. The mysterious Denisovans, the human ghosts of Asia. They didn't leave any cave art, no towns made of stone. There are no huge bones stacked in exhibit rooms. Still, the Denisovans are one of the most important and hard-to-find parts of the human family tree. The Denisovans were found not through big historical digs, but through the quiet work of genetic analysis. They are like ghosts in our blood, still living in the DNA of millions of people today. It all began in a cave. In 2010, scientists studying a small finger bone found in Siberia's Denisova cave made a finding that changed the way we think about how humans evolved. The DNA did not match that of Homo humans. It also didn't fit Neanderthals. It was something else, something brand new, a type of humans that had never been seen before. Scientists named them Denisovans after the cave where their secret was kept for tens of thousands of years. That finger bone, along with a few molars and a jawbone from the Tibetan Plateau, are almost all we have of them physically. And yet, what we've learned through genetics is remarkable. Denisovans weren't just isolated to one icy cave. They were widespread. Their genetic fingerprints show up in modern populations from China to Papua New Guinea. Some people living in Melanesia today carry as much as 5% Denisovan DNA. This suggests that Denisovans were once a major force across Asia, mixing with our ancestors and shaping the future of humanity before they disappeared. Unlike Neanderthals, who lived mostly in the cold grasslands and forests of Europe, Denisovans seem to favor diverse terrains, from high-altitude mountains to tropical valleys. The jawbone found on the Tibetan Plateau proves they could live at extreme altitudes, a place where even modern humans struggled to survive. Some scientists believe a gene that helps modern Tibetans live in low-oxygen environments was inherited from these ancient mountain dwellers, but their lifestyle, their tools, their art, those remain a mystery. No clear cultural artifacts have been definitively linked to Denisovans. Did they build shelters, use fire regularly, develop language? We simply don't know. In this way, Denisovans are like phantoms of prehistory, present, influential, but mostly unseen. Fearsome questions are raised by their story. How many of them were there? How far did they go? Also, why did they go away? Some scientists believe that Denisovans lived for hundreds of thousands of years before their genes and maybe even their culture mixed with those of other human species. Humans would have met the Denisovans as they moved into Asia. It's possible that some arguments turned violent. Others led to children. The genes they left behind still affect us today, and they affect things like our defense systems and how we adapt to our environments. Even more interesting is the fact that Denisovans and Neanderthals were connected to each other very closely, like cousins, but their evolutionary paths were very different. In fact, the remains of a girl whose mother was a Neanderthal and her father was a Denisovan has been found. She really was a mix. That means that these different types of humans didn't just live together. They merged, mixed, and affected each other's lives. We once thought human evolution was a straight line, Homo erectus to Homo sapiens, the end. But the Denisovans prove it was more like a braided river, with multiple human species branching out, meeting and merging again. The Denisovans are one of those hidden currents, and even though their bones are rare, their legacy is alive. Africa was a patchwork of human cradles. For many years, the story of how humans came to be was often told as a single path. All humans came from a single place, called Garden of Eden. But 300,000 years ago, Africa wasn't just one place where people were born. It was a continent full of cradles, and each one held a different part of our early history. It wasn't just that Africa was big, it was also very different. The land was made up of woods, savannas, deserts, and coasts. Not only were these areas beautiful, but they were also places where different groups of early humans tested their bodies, learned new habits, and changed the way they lived. Homo sapiens, the modern human species, did not come from a single small group in a single area. Instead, it seems more and more likely that we are a mix of different groups from across the continent. The fossil record backs this up. In Morocco, bones from Jebel Irhoud, dating back about 300,000 years, show skulls and features that look very similar to ours, making them the earliest known fossils of Homo sapiens. But they're not alone. In Ethiopia, Kenya, and South Africa, researchers have found other ancient human remains with both modern and archaic features. These discoveries suggest that early humans were evolving in parallel, exchanging genes, technologies, and ideas over thousands of miles. This view challenges the old single origin theory. Instead of one evolutionary spark, think of a network of campfires flickering across the continent. Some burned out, others merged. Eventually, they helped ignite the full flame of modern humanity. Even our ancient DNA hints at this complexity. Genetic studies show deep splits between early populations in Africa, suggesting groups were isolated long enough to develop unique traits, only to reconnect later. These cycles of separation and reunion may have made us more adaptable and resilient over time. One key factor was climate. Africa's environment was constantly shifting. Rainfall patterns changed, rivers appeared and disappeared. Grasslands turned to desert and back again. These changes forced human groups to move, adapt, or perish. In a sense, climate chaos pushed evolution forward, encouraging innovation, migration, and mingling between human groups that might have otherwise remained apart. We also know that technology is evolving. Some groups used sophisticated Levallois stone tools, which required careful shaping and planning. These tools appear in multiple regions across Africa, which shows that different populations were not just surviving. They were thinking, solving problems, and possibly even communicating in complex ways. But there's still so much we don't know. Some early humans vanished entirely, leaving behind only broken tools and fossilized bones. Others may have merged into the populations that would eventually become us. The deeper we dig, the more we find hints of forgotten branches, lost cousins, distant ancestors, unknown migrations. What's becoming clear is that Africa was never a backdrop to human history. It was a dynamic stage where evolution played out in different ways across different regions. Our species didn't walk out of one cradle. We were born from a continent's worth of experiments in survival, intelligence, and adaptability. So, when we talk about human origins, we're not just talking about a fossil in Morocco or a jawbone in Ethiopia. We're talking about a continent humming with life, with families, hunters, and inventors scattered across its hills, valleys, and coasts. The Sahara was a lush green paradise. 300,000 years ago, if you stood in the middle of the Sahara, you wouldn't see endless waves of sand or bleached, rocky desert. You'd find a world with rivers, lakes, fields, and animals instead. It would be so living that it would look more like Kenya today than a desert wasteland. The Sahara, which is now one of the toughest places on Earth, used to be a beautiful green paradise. This period is known as an African humid period, part of a larger climatic rhythm tied to the tilt and wobble of Earth's orbit. These natural cycles, called Milankovitch cycles, caused monsoons to strengthen, bringing heavy rains deep into North Africa. The result? A Sahara bursting with life. Fossil evidence tells the story clearly. Beneath the sands lie ancient lake beds, fossilized fish, crocodile remains, and even hippo bones, animals that cannot survive in the desert we know today. Satellite imagery reveals old river systems, now buried, that once braided across the Sahara. Some of them were so wide they rivaled the Nile. These rivers connected lake basins, forming a vast inland network of water highways. For early humans, this green Sahara wasn't just a place to survive, it was a crossroads. The fertile land supported herds of antelope, gazelle, elephants, and even giraffes. And with the prey came predators, big cats, hyenas, and maybe even now extinct saber-toothed relatives. Human groups likely moved across these savannas, hunting, gathering, and possibly meeting other populations. Artifacts scattered across the region, stone tools, arrowheads, and carved objects show that people weren't just passing through. They thrived here. Some researchers believe the Sahara served as a major corridor for migration, allowing early humans to move north into the Mediterranean or east toward the Nile Valley and beyond. In other words, the Sahara may have been one of the great launchpads of human expansion. There's even evidence of rock art etched into the cliffs and boulders of what are now barren hills. These artworks depict animals, humans, and scenes of daily life, hunting, herding, dancing. They're thousands of years younger than 300,000, but they're reminders that the Sahara was alive for much of its history, not just a one-time anomaly. The Green Sahara eventually went away. The monsoons got weaker, the rain stopped, plains of grass turned into sand, rivers stopped flowing. The people who stayed there had to leave, change, or die. This change happened slowly over thousands of years, but it changed the way people move around forever. People went to places that were safer, like the Nile Valley, the Sahel, or tropical woods further south. But the Sahara wasn't just empty space for a long time in the distant past. It had a healthy environment, plenty of food, and may have been a major force in human development and movement. So we need to change our ideas about what deserts are. They won't last forever, they come and go, and buried in the sands are signs to whole worlds that have been lost. Cave lions and saber-toothed cats ruled Eurasia. In Eurasia in the Stone Age, danger didn't just hide in the woods and open fields, it stalked, ran, and roared. There were no wolves or bears as the top hunters 300,000 years ago. They were big cats, strong, quiet, and huge. Not just any cats. It had saber-toothed teeth and looked like something from a nightmare. It lived with the Eurasian cave cat. The Eurasian cave lion, Panthera spilea, was one of the largest lions to ever exist. Fossils show that adult males could reach over 11 feet from nose to tail and stand nearly 4 feet tall at the shoulder, larger than modern African lions. But these lions weren't exactly the same as the ones we know today. They had shorter manes, robust limbs, and adaptations for surviving in cold, open environments. Imagine a giant golden lion with the muscles of a bear and the hunting instincts of a pack leader. That was the cave lion. Despite their name, cave lions didn't live in caves. They just died in them. Their bones are often found in cave systems where they either fell, were dragged by scavengers, or died while taking shelter. They hunted in packs, much like modern lions, but their prey was much larger: woolly mammoths, bison, reindeer, and even young rhinos. These were serious predators, capable of bringing down megafauna that would challenge most hunters. Even more terrifying was Homotherium, sometimes called the scimitar cat. Unlike the better-known Smilodon, which had long, curved saber teeth, Homotherium's fangs were shorter, sturdier, and better suited to slicing flesh. Think of it as a precision killer. Its limbs were long and built for speed. Its curved claws were retractable, and its posture resembled that of a hyena. It wasn't bulky. It was lean, fast, and efficient. Homotherium thrived in both Europe and Asia, often in colder regions, where its body was likely covered in a thick coat of fur. It hunted prey like mammoths, deer, and other large herbivores, possibly in coordinated groups. Fossil sites have revealed multiple individuals buried together, suggesting some degree of social behavior. What's haunting is that these cats weren't just fast or strong, they were widespread. Their remains stretch from the British Isles to Siberia and down into Africa. Wherever early humans or other hominins went, these cats weren't far behind. For our ancestors, the presence of such predators meant constant vigilance. A walk through the forest could turn into a deadly ambush. A night by the fire might attract curious eyes glowing from the dark. There were more than that. Lynxes that are as big as leopards. Leopards that look like panthers are prowling steep rocks. Even cheetahs, which are bigger now, ran across the green fields. It was a time when Eurasia was full of different ecosystems, and each one had its own quiet killer. For humans and other hominins, living alongside these cats wasn't optional. It was normal. Life was a daily balance between predator and prey. Stone tools offered some defense, fire another. But these cats were clever, fast, and patient. They didn't just charge, they waited, they tested weaknesses, and sometimes they won. Fossilized bones, cave drawings, and DNA from animals that are still alive are the only things that are left today. The beasts used to own Eurasia, though. They were in charge long before they were kept in zoos or put on flags and crests. The super crocodiles of sub-Saharan Africa. Long before Nile crocodiles claimed to be the scariest animals in Africa, even scarier giants roamed the continent's rivers and lakes. African crocodiles lived about 300,000 years ago. They were so big that they would have made modern crocodiles look small. One of them was an ancient animal called Crocodilus thorbjarnarssoni. It was a supercroc whose bite could break bones like twigs and was as long as a bus. Named in honor of the late crocodile expert John Thorbjarnarson, this ancient beast lived near the Turkana Basin in present-day Kenya. Fossil skulls alone stretch over 2.5 feet in length, suggesting a total body size of at least 25 feet, possibly more. For context, that's bigger than most great white sharks and longer than a fully grown giraffe is tall. In its watery realm, C. thorbjarnarssoni reigned supreme. It's not just the size that makes this croc terrifying. It was perfectly built for ambush. Like its modern cousins, it likely waited submerged near the water's edge, eyes just above the surface, motionless. When prey came close, whether a giant antelope, an early human, or a herd animal coming in to drink, it would strike, fast, violent, and final. A single lunge, a crunch, and the animal would vanish into the river with barely a splash left behind. This croc wasn't alone in its time. Other large species, including Mecosuchus and ancient relatives of the dwarf crocodile, coexisted across Africa's lush wetlands, rivers, and lakes. The continent was a patchwork of water-rich habitats teeming with prey, and that meant opportunity for predators. What's especially chilling is that early hominins were also present in these regions. Evidence suggests that some prehistoric humans may have been victims of crocodilian attacks. Bite marks on ancient bones match up with the dentition of these massive reptiles. Imagine being one of the first Homo sapiens, crouched at a stream to fill a gourd or wash a wound, and from the murky water emerges a living nightmare. Fast, silent, unavoidable. And acts like these happened a lot. Lions and leopards were dangerous on land, and alligators were dangerous near the water. Nile crocodiles are still one of the most dangerous animals in Africa for people. Then picture one that is twice as big and has an even stronger bite. In the beginning, there was no such thing as safe. You were in danger even when you went into the water. Aside from hunting, these crocodiles also played a huge ecological role. As apex predators, they helped control herbivore populations, shaped riverbank behavior, and influenced migration routes. Their very presence could shift the patterns of life around them. Animals would avoid certain watering holes. Humans would develop new survival behaviors, including the need for lookout systems, group movement, and tool-based defense. But like many megafauna, these super crocs didn't last forever. As climates shifted and human populations expanded, their range shrank. Some were hunted, others lost their habitats to drying rivers or competing species. Eventually, only their bones were left to tell the story. Volcanoes that shaped human evolution. People often talk about DNA, movement, and tools when they talk about how humans evolved. But below the surface, volcanoes were constantly changing our future in an even bigger way. Volcanic events were shaping the past of hominins around 300,000 years ago, long before Mount Vesuvius buried Pompeii, and before people made maps of the Ring of Fire. These eruptions were sometimes loud and violent, but they always had effects. In East Africa, where many scientists believe our species first emerged, the landscape was a volcanic minefield. The Great Rift Valley, a vast geological scar stretching across several countries, was, and still is, shaped by tectonic shifts and volcanic activity. Towering stratovolcanoes like Mount Longonot, Mount Meru, and Mount Elgon weren't just landmarks, they were ticking time bombs. These volcanoes didn't just produce ash clouds, they reshaped ecosystems. When one erupted, entire regions were blanketed in lava, ash, and toxic gases. Plants died, water sources became poisoned, and prey animals either fled or perished. For early humans, this meant they had to adapt quickly or die. Entire populations could be displaced in a single day, but this constant upheaval may have actually pushed human development forward. How? Because surroundings change, people have to adjust. Hominins had to move when an otherwise green valley turned into ash overnight. They had to find new areas to live in, come up with new ways to find food, and learn how to stay away from dangerous natural areas. These problems might have helped people's minds grow, which would have made flexible thinkers more likely to live and have children. Volcanoes also created mineral-rich soils, which regenerated plant life faster than other landscapes. So while destruction was the first act, renewal came swiftly after. This made volcanic zones a paradox, dangerous yet abundant. Hominins likely learned to time their return, following the regrowth of grasses, fruits, and grazing animals. Then there's the issue of visibility. Volcanoes, especially those that regularly erupted, shaped how humans understood their world. Even without science, early humans witnessed the awesome power of molten rock, lightning-filled ash clouds, and mountains that spoke. Some anthropologists believe these experiences seeded early mythologies, gods of fire, sky, and punishment. One of the most influential examples is the Olduino Lengai volcano in Tanzania, often called the Mountain of God by the Maasai. It still erupts today, and it sits near several key archaeological sites like Laetoli and Olduvai Gorge, where early hominins once walked. Though Olduino Lengai's unique lava flows aren't as explosive, its long-term presence likely shaped migration routes, food chains, and human behavior in the region. Volcanic ash even saved early tracks in the form of fossils. The famous Laetoli tracks, which are 3.6 million years old, were found in a layer of fine volcanic ash that got harder over time. That's how we know how big early hominins were, how they walked, and how they went places with groups. These signs might have been lost forever if volcanoes weren't around. Of course, volcanoes weren't always helpful. Some likely caused local extinctions. A powerful eruption could collapse a delicate food web in days. It's possible that entire hominin groups were wiped out or driven to extinction because of volcanic winters or toxic ash clouds. There's also the matter of timing. Some scientists propose that key mutations in early Homo sapiens and other hominins may have gained an edge during periods of volcanic crisis. Stress changes populations. Bottlenecks, where only a few individuals survive, can accelerate evolution by concentrating specific traits. In a strange way, volcanoes may have sped up our rise through hardship. Toba's older cousins, the mega eruptions you never heard of. When people think of terrible volcanic events, the Toba supereruption from about 74,000 years ago comes to mind. It was huge, changed the world, and could have been very bad for early humans. But here's the catch. Toba wasn't the first place like this. Earth had already been hit by many supervolcanoes, some of which were just as powerful as the one that changed the climate, and maybe even our genes. Many of these eruptions have been lost to history. Around 300,000 years ago, the planet had its own league of catastrophic eruptions, Toba's older cousins, that left deep scars on the Earth and possibly on the trajectory of human evolution. These weren't just your average lava-spewing volcanoes. They were planet changers, capable of plunging the globe into volcanic winters, choking the skies with ash, and redrawing coastlines. One of the lesser-known giants is the Atapuerca eruption complex, linked with tectonic and volcanic disturbances in the Iberian Peninsula. Though not a supervolcano by modern definitions, its extended activity and massive regional impact may have contributed to shifting migration routes of early Neanderthals and Homo heidelbergensis, especially as volcanic ash spread across Europe. Further east, in what is now central Italy, the Alban Hills volcanic district was waking up. Around 300,000 years ago, these volcanoes experienced some of their most violent periods. The explosions sent ash clouds as far as southern Europe, temporarily altering the region's rainfall and temperature patterns. What's more, they likely carved out new lakes and valleys, changing not just ecosystems, but where early humans could live, hunt, and drink. At the same time, the Awasa caldera and other volcanoes in the East African Rift Valley in what is now Ethiopia were able to have intense Plinian eruptions, which are those tall, column-shaped blasts that spread ash over large areas. People have lived in this area for a very long time. Volcanic activity in this area could have caused large population changes, pushed people to adapt to new food sources, or kept hominin groups apart for long enough to cause genetic divergence. Another strange place is the Yellowstone hotspot, which had its last big earthquake about 640,000 years ago. Even though this happened before 300,000 years ago, its effects were felt for tens of thousands of years. The huge caldera that was formed would have taken thousands of years to fully settle. Its effects on North America's environment would have been felt for thousands of years, and it's likely that it helped megafauna spread and grow. If early humans or their prehistoric cousins came to the Americas much earlier than we think, the climate after Yellowstone could have been a major obstacle or a great place to start. But these volcanoes didn't only shape the land, they reshaped the climate. Even moderate-sized eruptions can inject sulfur aerosols into the stratosphere, reflecting sunlight and cooling the planet. Now imagine a super eruption, dozens of cubic kilometers of ash, gas and debris ejected into the sky. Temperatures could drop several degrees globally. For months, maybe years, the sun would dim. Rainfall would become erratic. Crops, if they existed, would fail. Natural food sources would vanish. Hominins would be thrown into survival mode. And yet, these moments of terror may have also opened doors. After the sky cleared and the dust settled, new ecosystems bloomed. Species that had adapted to the chaos thrived. Those that didn't vanished. In that vacuum, new niches opened, and new species rose to fill them. It's entirely plausible that human ancestors experienced both devastation and opportunity in the wake of these prehistoric catastrophes. Even though Toba gets all the press, it was really just the most recent episode in a long story about rocks. The Earth has always been a little rough, and about 300,000 years ago, the world's volcanoes were not giants that were resting. They were busy, causing problems, and may have been necessary for the evolutionary tests that led to us. The mammoth was already here, and it was huge. These huge animals were already marching across the frozen fields of Eurasia long before the last ice age hit its peak, and before people carved mammoths into cave walls. Sometime around 300,000 years ago, the steppe mammoth, Mammothus trogontherii, which was an early ancestor of the woolly mammoth, roamed the cold open fields from Western Europe to Siberia. There was no doubt about it. They were even bigger than the famous giant mammoths that came after them. The steppe mammoth wasn't just large, it was among the largest elephant species to ever exist. Males could reach 13 to 15 feet tall at the shoulder and weigh up to 15 tons, making them heavier than most modern-day African elephants and towering over the woolly mammoths we usually picture. Their tusks alone could grow over 15 feet long, curving dramatically outward like massive ivory scythes, possibly used for mating battles or clearing snow from frozen grasses. But these giants weren't built for warm forests or dense jungles. They were early specialists in cold, open environments. The Pleistocene was already growing colder, and the spread of dry grasslands was transforming ecosystems across the globe. Mammoths thrived in this change. They had thick layers of fat, dense bones to support their weight, and early forms of the insulating hair that their woolly descendants would perfect. These were the beta versions of Ice Age megafauna, massive, hardy, and mobile. They weren't just isolated to the north either. Their range stretched deep into Central Asia and even into parts of Europe that today are covered by forests or cities. Back then, these regions were part of vast mammoth steppe environments, treeless plains with low shrubs, grasses, and herbs that provided the perfect buffet for such grazing giants. And where mammoths went, ecosystems followed. Their movement shaped landscapes. They knocked down trees, churned the soil, and cleared pathways for smaller herbivores. In a way, mammoths were prehistoric bulldozers, reshaping the world with every migration. Their dung fertilized the land, and their carcasses, when they fell, fed carnivores, scavengers, and early humans alike. One of the most interesting things about this time period is that early Homo sapiens, Homo heidelbergensis, and Neanderthals may have met steppe mammoths. Mammoth bones that have been killed have been found in fossils that date back hundreds of thousands of years, long before cave art or planned mammoth hunts. These weren't great fights between humans and animals, though. Most of the interactions were probably scavenging events or random killings of people who were stuck or hurt. The presence of such large prey would have influenced early human behavior. Mammoth carcasses provided huge quantities of meat, fat, and bone. Their hides could have been used for shelter and their tusks for tools or weapons. In this sense, the mammoth wasn't just a roaming animal. It was a mobile survival kit, an anchor in an otherwise brutal environment. What's even more interesting is how mammoth numbers changed over time. The mammoth on the steppe changed. Over tens of thousands of years, smaller size, denser fur, and traits better suited to cold weather were preferred by natural selection. This led to the rise of Mammuthus primigenius, the famous woolly mammoth. It wasn't a big jump. The ice, the wind, and the slow pounding motion of glacier cycles shaped the change over time. While the woolly mammoth may be the poster child of the Ice Age, its gigantic ancestor was already roaming Earth 300,000 years ago, a living preview of the megafaunal age to come. Prehistoric megafauna of Australia before humans arrived. Australia was home to some of the weirdest and biggest animals the world had ever seen long before the first people arrived. Around 300,000 years ago, Australia was a land apart. It had been cut off from the rest of the world for millions of years, so its megafauna were different from those on other continents. There were no saber-toothed cats, cave bears, or mammoths here. It was instead ruled by huge marsupials, birds higher than basketball hoops, and wombats as big as cars. One of the most iconic giants of this era was the Diprotodon, the largest marsupial to ever live. Think of it as a wombat crossed with a rhinoceros. This plant-eating behemoth could weigh up to 3 tons and stretch over 13 feet long. Despite its size, the Diprotodon was a gentle browser, feeding on leaves and shrubs that dotted the open woodlands and grasslands of Pleistocene Australia. Fossil evidence suggests it moved in herds, and that it likely lived a lifestyle similar to that of modern-day elephants. Slow, cautious, but influential in shaping its environment. Then there was the terrifying Thylacoleo carnifex, also known as the marsupial lion. Don't let the name fool you. This wasn't a feline, but a close relative of today's wombats and koalas. It had powerful jaws, retractable claws, and a bite force stronger than any other mammal its size. This top predator likely ambushed its prey from trees or dense underbrush, bringing down animals much larger than itself, including young diprotodons. At about the size of a modern leopard, Thylacoleo was compact, muscular, and utterly lethal. Alongside these creatures strode the Genyornis, a flightless bird larger than an ostrich, sometimes called a thunderbird. Standing over 7 feet tall and weighing more than 500 pounds, Genyornis likely fed on fruits, small animals, and possibly eggs of other birds. It would have been a dominant figure in the Australian ecosystem, filling the same niche that large birds like the moa or elephant bird filled elsewhere in the world. The Procoptodon Goliath, a huge short-faced kangaroo, should also not be forgotten. This hopper wasn't like most. It was up to 10 feet tall, had eyes that faced forward to help it see deeper, and moved more like a gorilla than a modern kangaroo. It was surprisingly fast in open spaces for how big it was, and how strong its legs were. It acted more like a grazing deer than a grass-eating kangaroo, because it used its strong arms to pull down trees and eat plants high up. All of these animals thrived in a world without human interference. Back then, the landscape was shaped more by climate and natural cycles than by fires or tools. The continent experienced fluctuating dry and wet periods, and the megafauna adapted accordingly. Some species evolved long-distance migratory behavior. Others went into seasonal dormancy or developed specialized diets to survive harsh conditions. And because Australia had few large predators, many of its herbivores became massive without needing heavy armor or speed to escape attacks. This ecological balance created a unique mix of species, a self-contained world where marsupial giants filled the roles that elephants, lions, and buffalo filled elsewhere. At this point, no people had come to the land yet. In another 50,000 to 60,000 years, that wouldn't happen. So, Australia in 300,000 BCE is a picture of evolution going on without any problems. It's a look into a time that no one remembers when animals got big, weird, and brave. But these megafauna wouldn't last forever. When humans finally did arrive, the balance would tip. Many of these giants disappeared shortly afterward, likely due to a mix of climate shifts and hunting pressure. That's what makes this time period so hauntingly beautiful. A moment of wild perfection, frozen just before the fall. Giant sloths in the Americas. Imagine walking through a dense forest in what's now South America. Tall trees, thick underbrush, the humid air buzzing with life. Suddenly, the trees part, and you see a creature the size of an elephant slowly lumbering through the foliage. It stands upright, pulling down branches with long claws and a slow, deliberate motion. This wasn't some strange bear or lost mammoth. It was a giant ground sloth. And 300,000 years ago, it was one of the most dominant herbivores in the Americas. These ancient sloths were not the sleepy tree dwellers we know today. While modern sloths are small, shy, and mostly live in the trees, their prehistoric ancestors were huge, muscular, and ground-based. Some species, like Megatherium, could grow over 20 feet long and weigh more than 4 tons. That's roughly the size of a modern elephant, except this elephant had claws nearly a foot long and walked on the sides of its feet like a bear. Megatherium was just one of many species in this bizarre and fascinating family. There were smaller types like Glossitherium, which lived in open grasslands, and Erematherium, which preferred forests and coastal plains. But all of them had similar features: massive claws, barrel-shaped bodies, thick bones, and powerful muscles. Despite their strength, they were primarily plant eaters, feeding on leaves, shrubs, fruits, and even tough grasses. There was no need for these sloths to hurry. Most animals that could eat them were too big to handle. Saber-toothed catpacks or other big carnivores are the only ones that would attack a young animal or someone who is sick. Their size and, if necessary, their claws were their main defenses. One swipe from a Megatherium could cut through a predator's skin or knock it out of the way. What's especially remarkable is how well adapted these creatures were to their environments. Their long tongues helped them strip leaves, their wide molars ground up fibrous plants, and their large nasal passages may have helped cool their blood or detect distant vegetation. In some species, fossil evidence suggests they dug large burrows, essentially underground shelters that could span several meters across. These weren't just shelters for a nap. They may have provided refuge from heat, floods, or even wildfires. Giant sloths roamed from Argentina to southern parts of the modern United States, spanning a vast range of habitats, from tropical jungles to arid plains. They were important to the ecosystem, acting like living bulldozers that cleared vegetation and helped maintain the balance between forest and grassland. Some researchers believe they even helped disperse seeds, giving rise to entire plant species that relied on them. But even though these huge sloths were famous, they also hint at a bigger mystery. Why did they disappear? A lot of giant sloths died out around 10,000 years ago, during the last big mass extinction at the end of the Pleistocene. It's still not clear what caused it. Climate change probably played a part because it changed where they lived and made food less available. But the fact that people came to the Americas only a few thousand years before the end may have been the final straw. Early shooters likely had an easy time killing these big, slow-moving animals, especially when they were caught near watering holes or on open tracks. Today, the only sloths that remain are small, tree-bound, and endangered. They're like echoes of a forgotten age, gentle survivors in a world that once belonged to giants. The ocean was a Jurassic-scale death trap. Mammoths and giant sloths ruled the land 300,000 years ago, but the oceans were just as dangerous, full of animals that could swallow a grown man whole. This world wasn't run by dinosaurs, but by monsters from the past that had become perfectly adapted to living in the deep. Anything that swam in this water had to be built to last because it was warm and the currents were strong. By this time, the infamous megalodon, the largest shark to ever live, was long gone, having vanished about 2 million years earlier. But don't let that fool you into thinking the seas were safe. New monsters had taken its place. One of the top ocean predators of the time was the Leviathan melvillei, a whale the size of a bus with teeth as long as kitchen knives. Named after the biblical sea monster Leviathan and inspired by Moby Dick, this creature wasn't a gentle filter feeder like today's blue whales. Leviathan hunted other whales, with a bite that rivaled a Tyrannosaurus and the strength to dive deep and launch attacks from below. It was a marine apex predator, unlike any alive today. Alongside Leviathan swam giant sharks like Otodus jubutensis, a massive cousin of the megalodon that likely overlapped in time. These sharks may have reached 30-40 feet in length, with jaws capable of slicing through the thick hides of whales, seals, or even prehistoric turtles. They didn't just bite, they crushed. The oceans were also full of giant squid and cephalopods, which may have grown even larger than the ones we know today. And where there are squid, there are hunters, like early species of sperm whales, which had already evolved deep diving abilities and sonar capabilities. Battles between these two giants of the deep, whale and squid, may have played out in utter darkness, thousands of feet below the surface, where no light could reach. It wasn't just about size, though. The seas were fast and full of plans. Dolphins were already smart, quick, and social, and they lived in groups. Even though orcas weren't yet the main predators they are now, their ancestors were already starting to hunt together. These early ocean hunters were smart and worked well with others to catch bigger animals, which isn't often seen in animals. And the coastline, it was no safer. Saltwater crocodiles, or their massive ancestors, lurked in brackish waters and river mouths. Some of these reptiles were longer than a pickup truck and had one of the strongest bite forces ever recorded in nature. They waited in silence, lunging at anything that dared drink from the shore, including early humans and other mammals. It wasn't even quiet on the ocean floor. Huge rays and bottom feeders, some with poisonous spines, moved along the ocean floor. Coral reefs were full of color and life, but they were also hiding places for old moray eels and big fish with mouths that could open like snakes. In short, the ocean of 300,000 years ago was a Jurassic-scale death trap, an ecosystem where size, speed, intelligence, and sheer brutality dictated who lived and who got eaten. The surface might have looked calm, but just beneath the waves, evolution was still sharpening its teeth. This marine chaos was essential to the balance of Earth's biosphere. The food chains of the deep helped regulate climate, move nutrients across the planet, and even shape coastal ecosystems that early humans would eventually explore. But to survive in that world, you needed more than just fins or flippers. You needed teeth, tactics, and timing. Prehistoric forests in Europe were tropical. You might think of icy tundras and snow-covered mountains when you think of Europe 300,000 years ago. The land was stuck in an ice age that would never end. But the truth is even stranger. A lot of Europe, especially in the south and center, was covered with thick, warm woods that were full of living things. As we know it now, it wasn't even cold. In many places it was green, humid, and even tropical. We were living in an interglacial period, a warm phase between major ice ages. During this time, massive glaciers still covered parts of Scandinavia and the Alps, but much of the continent below was thriving with greenery. Think sprawling oak, beech, and chestnut forests, thick canopies of leaves that let in only streaks of sunlight. The forest floor was often covered with mosses, ferns, and mushrooms, alive with insects and small mammals. This environment was perfect for some of the most powerful animals of the time. European forest elephants, for instance, were enormous creatures. Not quite woolly mammoths, but close. They roamed these woodlands, feeding on soft bark and fresh leaves. Their tusks curved dramatically and could reach up to 13 feet in length. The forests were home to the Eurasian cave lion, which was even larger than today's African lions, and possibly hunted in groups. These lions were powerful enough to take down not just deer and boars, but young mammoths and elephants as well. Unlike modern lions, they lacked manes and were adapted for the dense forest environment. Another predator, one even stranger, was Homotherium, a type of saber-toothed cat, sometimes called the scimitar cat. Unlike the famous Smilodon, Homotherium had shorter, curved fangs and long, powerful limbs built for speed. It hunted during the day, likely in packs, and may have used teamwork to trap prey in tight forest corridors. It was fast, smart, and lethal, Europe's own version of a land shark. These forests were also filled with smaller but equally interesting creatures. Herds of red deer, aurochs, ancient wild cattle, and wild horses grazed in open meadows between the trees. Beavers, otters, and waterfowl filled the wetlands and rivers, while giant birds of prey soared above, scanning the underbrush for movement. The variety of environments in prehistoric Europe meant that you could travel from dense jungles to open plains in just a few days. Some areas resembled modern rainforests, with towering trees and thick vines, while others looked like African savannas, dotted with shrubs and broken canopies. This patchwork of ecosystems supported an incredibly rich web of life. What's even more interesting is how these warm woods got to places in Europe that are now cool and mild. Fossils show that species that now only live in the Mediterranean or even warm regions used to live in southern England, France, and Germany. It's hard to imagine animals like straight-tusked elephants, hippopotamuses, and big tortoises living in places that get frost today. But it's true. This climate also created opportunities for early humans and their relatives. Neanderthals and Homo heidelbergensis hunted and gathered in these forests, using wooden spears, stone tools, and fire. These were not primitive brutes. They were skilled survivalists, tracking animals through thick brush, fishing in rivers, and foraging for berries, nuts, and roots beneath the trees. The forests were not only a source of food, but also of shelter and warmth. Tree trunks became shelters. Bark was used for tools. Firewood was plentiful. For early humans, Europe's prehistoric forests were not a challenge to overcome. They were home. But as Earth's climate shifted and glaciers advanced again, many of these lush forests would eventually shrink, giving way to colder environments and fewer resources. For a brief period, however, Europe was not the frozen wilderness of Ice Age cartoons. It was a thriving, almost tropical world, buzzing with life and danger in equal measure. The human voice was just evolving. Think about trying to stay alive in a world full of dangerous animals without being able to talk. There are no names, alerts, or ways to say, "Be careful" or "Come help." That was the case for a lot of human history. But things started to change around 300,000 years ago. Early Homo humans, Neanderthals, and other relatives were starting to learn how to speak clearly. It wasn't yet full of words or beautiful stories, but something new was starting to take shape. People were giving birth to their first sounds. Scientists believed that by this time, the physical building blocks of speech were falling into place. One of the key clues is the hyoid bone, a small horseshoe-shaped bone located in the throat. In modern humans, it supports the tongue and is crucial for making speech sounds. Fossils of early Homo sapiens and even Neanderthals show a hyoid bone that looks nearly identical to ours, suggesting that these ancient people might have had the anatomical ability to talk. But having the hardware is just part of the puzzle. The brain also needs to be able to control complex muscles and interpret sounds. That's where things get even more interesting. Around this time, early humans were developing larger and more specialized Broca's and Wernicke's areas in the brain, two regions involved in speech production and comprehension. These areas help control how we form words, understand others, and link sound to meaning. Fossil skulls and brain endocasts show that these areas were present and possibly functional in both early Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. So what did they sound like? It probably wasn't a full-blown language the way we speak today. It was more likely a mix of grunts, cries, rhythmic patterns, and simple sounds with shared meanings, like vocal warnings for danger, basic commands during a hunt, or sounds to express emotions like fear or joy. Some researchers believe these early forms of communication may have had a musical quality, more like song than speech. This makes sense when you think about how language evolved. Before words, there was tone. Before grammar, there was rhythm. It's possible that early humans sang their feelings, warned with pitch, and comforted with melody, long before they told stories. Once humans could communicate, they could coordinate hunts, share survival tips, and pass down knowledge. They could build bonds, form families, and eventually create culture. Language gave our ancestors a mental advantage over every other species on the planet, not just because they could talk, but because they could think in more complex ways. It wasn't just humans either. The evidence we have shows that Neanderthals probably could also speak. Their DNA has the FOXP2 gene, which is important for language development in people. The way their neck, chest, and head are built also supports the idea that they could make different sounds. They probably spoke a language that was different from ours, but still useful and made sense. You might have been able to tell who it was by their tone alone, even if they didn't say anything. Toolkits of the early genius. People were already making things long before computers, power tools, and even writing. A little over 300,000 years ago, early Homo humans and close cousins like Neanderthals were not only staying alive, but they were also planning for the future. The tools they left behind are one of the best ways to tell. This wasn't the era of simple rocks bashed together to make a sharp edge. By 300,000 years ago, something more sophisticated had emerged, the Levallois technique. This method involved carefully preparing a stone core before knocking off a flake in a single, planned strike. The result? A sharp, flat tool that could be used for cutting meat, scraping hides, or even shaping wood. What's important here isn't just the result, it's the thought process behind it. This technique required planning several steps in advance, understanding geometry, and even visualizing the final tool before it was created. That's the kind of thinking we associate with modern humans. When Levallois tools first came out, they were a huge step forward in how smart people are. Not just rocks. These were ideas that had been made by skill and imagination. They weren't just made by someone who was living day to day. They were working out a problem, and it wasn't just Homo sapiens. Neanderthals across Europe and Western Asia were using the same method. This shows that multiple human species, independently or through cultural contact, had developed a shared understanding of abstract thinking and tool-making. Their brains were not just big, they were smart. Some early humans were using wooden spears, carefully carved and hardened by fire, to hunt large animals. One famous example comes from Schöningen, Germany, where 8 spears, each over 6 feet long, were found alongside horse bones. These weapons date back more than 300,000 years and are perfectly balanced for throwing. Think about that. Not only were they making tools, they were making ranged weapons. This tells us something deeper. These early humans understood their environment. They knew how to find the right kind of wood, shape it, test it, and use it effectively. They didn't just respond to the world, they adapted it. Even more amazing are the tools from this time that were composite, which means they were made from more than one material. For instance, natural glues like plant oil or tar may have been used to attach stone tips to wooden rods. To do that, you need to gather the right materials, heat or press them to make them ready, and then carefully put them together. It's kind of like making a stick with a metal tip and epoxy glue in the Stone Age. That level of complexity doesn't happen by accident. It means these people had memory, instruction, and maybe even teaching. One person probably showed another. Skills passed down from parent to child. Knowledge that lasted longer than a single lifetime. By this time, early humans were also making scrapers to clean animal hides, awls to punch holes in materials, and possibly even digging sticks for gathering roots. Every one of these tools tells the same story. These weren't primitive brutes, they were innovators. If you could walk into one of their camps, you might see someone chipping away at stone, another roasting a stick over fire to harden it, and someone else rubbing resin between their fingers to make glue. You'd hear the tap of a rock on rock, the crackle of fire, the quiet focus of hands that knew exactly what they were doing. We often call them prehistoric, as if that means simple. But 300,000 years ago, people were already solving problems, planning hunts, crafting weapons, and shaping the future, one stone at a time. The real prehistoric world was loud, dangerous, and wild. Don't bother with the slow, quiet dioramas in museums. 300,000 years ago, Earth was living, but in the noisiest, messiest way you can imagine. Each sound meant something. Every darkness could be a danger. And for early humans, every day meant figuring out how to live in a world that was both beautiful and uncertain. In the early morning, the air buzzed, not with cars or cities, but with the cries of giant birds, the distant howls of predators, and the rustling of prey through the underbrush. Giant mammals, including elephant-sized proboscideans and towering giraffes, walked across open savannas. The ground shook beneath their steps. Insects swarmed in thick clouds. Frogs croaked in chorus along lush riversides. And humans, they were tiny players in this sprawling ecosystem. No claws, no fangs, just brains, grit, and sharp tools. Everything around them was faster, stronger, or deadlier. But they learned to listen, really listen. A shift in birdsong might mean a lion is near. The snap of a twig could be a predator, or dinner. there were different kinds of danger. In Africa, you might see lions hiding in tree limbs or crocodiles longer than a van in muddy rivers. Cave lions or saber-toothed cats lived in the woods in Europe or Asia. They were fast and sneaky hunters. You didn't always see them coming either. In this world, survival was a team sport. Early humans formed bands for protection. You kept your eyes on the kids. You slept light. You watched the fire. Even at night, when the world cooled and darkened, you weren't safe. The night brought owls with 6-foot wingspans, wolves that hunted in silence, and eyes, always eyes, blinking in the distance. But it wasn't just dangerous animals. The earth was moving around a lot. In the distance, volcanoes shook and exploded. The sky wasn't always blue. Ash could turn it red, and strange auroras could make it glow. The floods came quickly. Dry spells lasted for a long time. Over many years, forests changed into fields and back again. You changed, or you disappeared. Yet despite the chaos, life thrived. Herds migrated across vast plains. Lakes shimmered in the sun. Trees flowered in tropical forests. There was time for wonder, for storytelling, for play. Children would splash in streams or throw stones for fun. Adults laughed around fires, swapped knowledge, and sometimes, just sometimes, watched a sunset without fear. If you stepped out alone without a plan, you might not come back. If your tribe lost the fire, it could mean disaster. A twisted ankle in the wrong place, a storm on the wrong day, or a mistake near the wrong animal, and it could all end. Still, these early humans endured. They learned the rhythms of their world, when to hunt, when to hide, when to move. And slowly, they didn't just survive. They began to shape their surroundings, with fire, with tools, with cooperation, with memory. They passed on what they knew, where to find the best stone, how to track gazelle through dust, how to spot crocodile trails at a riverbank. These lessons became stories, passed from elders to the young, anchoring each generation to the next. The world of 300,000 years ago wasn't a frozen wasteland. It was a tangled, roaring ecosystem, a patchwork of life, climate, and evolution colliding in every direction. Humanity wasn't alone. The Earth didn't wait for us, and survival was earned, not promised. As we peel back the layers of sediment and time, what we uncover isn't just ancient history, it's the blueprint of who we are. Subscribe for more immersive journeys into Earth's lost worlds, and tell us in the comments, which part of this prehistoric planet would you have survived or ruled?